Hello, this is Mr. Tatum. This week we're going to focus on text structure, and specifically, we're going to look at how authors create different plot structures by manipulating time in the way that they tell their stories. Now, why think like this? Why go through this trouble of thinking about how the story is told? Well, using different structures or different techniques in terms of text structure helps writers tell more interesting stories. And if we recognize these different moves that writers make, it can help us craft our own stories in more interesting ways. So there are some basic types of plot structure, and all of these have to do with how the writer tells their story, not what it's about or what the theme is or what the message is, like we were thinking about in previous weeks, but more looking at how they're choosing to tell it and structure it. And specifically, we're going to look at different ways that they do that with time. The most common type of plot structure is called linear or chronological. This is where time just flows very simply through the story from beginning to the middle to the end without any kind of interruptions. Maybe there's some quick flashbacks or something like that, but mostly it's just going from beginning to the middle through the end. In parallel structure, there are two or more related stories that are happening at the same time. This has become pretty popular in books recently, where you have like two different characters, and one chapter you get one character's point of view, and the next chapter you get another character's point of view. So that is called parallel structure, where there are two storylines happening at the same time. Nonlinear or fractured storytelling is when the story jumps around through time and different places. Oftentimes it's like little vignettes or flashes of memory. You might remember we read some sections from The House on Mango Street. That is a kind of fractured narrative because we're getting these different pictures from different places throughout the story. This one is less common, and it's a little bit harder to keep track of. It's more advanced. Circular is the last kind of plot structure, and like a circle, this is where the story begins and ends in the same place. And usually the way it does that is it starts out at like an exciting moment in the story, and then you get this long flashback that lets you know how you got there, and then it ends from there. Let's look at what each of these looks like. So in linear stories, you've got the beginning, middle, end, and it usually follows a structure like this: exposition, introduction of a conflict, rising action, building to a turning point or a climax, and then falling down to a resolution. In parallel structure, like I said, there are these two separate storylines that are happening at the same time. And usually there's some like interaction between the two stories, like maybe the characters meet, or maybe they are all looking at one kind of event and sharing their perspectives about that. Nonlinear or fragmented, like I said, it kind of jumps around with these separate little stories happening, usually to the same person and the same people, but taken from different contexts and kind of out of place. And here's circular, like I said, kind of starting at the beginning and then usually following this long flashback and then winding up in the same place at the end. Here's some examples. So most stories follow the linear time structure. Think about Lord of the Flies, right? We saw them crash land on the island, and then everything just happens building up to the turning point at the end of that story. And it all just happens through time in a kind of normal way. This is a story that I've been suggesting you read for independent reading. It's called Superhuman by Nicola Yoon, and it's a good example of circular structure. Let me just show you what that looks like on the page here. Here's the story. And you can see it starts off like boom, right in the action. The first sentence is, "It's when X, the world's one and only superhero, starts to pull off his mask, that Sairida realizes they are all going to die anyway. It's kind of a relief, really. Her task to save humanity from destruction is impossible. Everyone knows that. But if X has already made up his mind, then it doesn't matter what she says. So this pushes us right in the middle of this action, and we kind of get that for the next 3 pages. But then there's a break right here, and this sentence starts out 3 days ago, and we get this flashback that leads us up through to the rest of the story. And then by the end of the story, it winds up back at that moment where it started, and we kind of see the conclusion of it. I'm just going to pause this quickly. Yeah, so this story is an example of circular structure. So if you want to read that for independent reading, it's a good story. A Private Experience, which we just read, is mostly linear. It has a beginning, middle, end through the events, but there is some non-linear storytelling where there are these flash forwards where it says like later Chica will. That kind of takes us out of that regular linear narrative and makes it non-linear by giving us information that the character doesn't even have in the moment. And finally, Long Way Down is a really interesting example of storytelling structure. Again, it's mostly linear, but it's got some non-linear elements to it and even some circular elements to it in the elevator chapters. So if you remember, like the story mostly goes from him right after his brother was killed up through his elevator ride to the bottom of the elevator. That's kind of the main linear part of the story. But he's constantly having these flashbacks to his childhood with Sean. And then in the elevator chapters, most of those follow a circular structure where the person that Will meets gets on the elevator with him. And then we get this long flashback of that person telling their story and knowing who they are. But then, boom, we're right back in the elevator with them at the next floor. So each of those elevators is kind of a circular chapter. So how to identify plot structure? Really just look at how the time in the story changes and notice if it moves straight through from beginning and end or if it jumps around in any kind of way. And if you notice that it jumps around, look for patterns in how it's jumping around. How is the author manipulating time? Ask yourself what structure the pattern best fits. Is it more of a circular structure? Is it a parallel structure? Is it a non-linear? Is there not really a pattern to it? Is it just kind of jumping around? All right, now you're ready to take the form, just checking your understanding of this mini lesson. Feel free to replay this lesson if you need to. And then to practice, I'm going to have us all read Indian Education by Sherman Alexie, where he tells a true story from his own life in a certain kind of way. And I want to see if you notice what narrative structure he is using and how time is working in this story. All right, let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.